He stood at the front of the boardroom and told 12 people, including 2 who had watched me grow up in the mill yard, that I was too attached to the past to be trusted with the future of the company. That was 4 years ago. Last March, he phoned me from that same building, asking if I would come back and fix what he had spent 4 years breaking. My name is Harriet Blaine, and the building in question is Blaine and Chard Millworks, the company my grandfather started with a business partner in 1971 out of a single-planer shed on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay. I grew up in that shed. Not metaphorically. I mean, I was physically there, sitting on a wooden stool in the corner, watching the edger run while my father went over production sheets at a folding table he'd set up near the back wall. By the time I was 12, I could identify the species of a board from across the room by the color of the heartwood. By the time I was 19, I could read a lumber grade, the way some people read music, without thinking, just knowing. I never questioned that I belonged there. It was the first true thing I had ever known about myself. My father ran the business for 22 years before his heart gave out on a Tuesday in February, at 61 at his desk, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and a procurement summary for the following quarter still open on his screen. He hadn't been sick, exactly. He'd been tired in the way that men of his generation confused with being busy. He ignored it until it became something that couldn't be ignored anymore, and by then it was too late for anyone to do anything about it. He didn't leave a formal succession plan. What he left was an understanding, spoken between the two of us over years in pieces, never written down because neither of us thought we had to write it down, that I would eventually take on the operations side of the company. Not as a birthright. Not as a gift someone hands you because of your last name. As the natural result of the fact that I was the one who'd been in that mill every summer since I was a child, who'd earned a business degree and then spent 2 years running production scheduling for a cabinetry manufacturer up in Barrie before coming back, who understood the grain and the rhythm of the place in ways that came from time and not from title. My uncle had other plans. He was my father's younger brother and had sat on the board since my grandfather's era, mostly in a financial oversight capacity. He was not a mill person. He was a handshake and client dinner person, good in a room, comfortable with a balance sheet from a distance, the kind of man who knew how to make a company look healthy, without necessarily knowing how to keep it healthy. When my father died, the board appointed him interim CEO while they sorted out what came next. I was 29. I told myself the word interim meant what it said. I was patient. I had always been patient. 6 months later, he called a full board meeting and I was invited to attend. I put on a good blazer and drove the 2.5 hours north from Barrie with a folder of notes about the production backlog and a quietly held assumption that my interim period was about to end. He stood at the head of that table and, in the careful tone of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say until it sounds measured instead of personal, told the board that Blaine and Chard needed leadership capable of navigating industry consolidations without being slowed down by. And I am quoting him, exactly, because I have never forgotten a syllable of it. Sentimental attachment to legacy operations and outmoded production philosophy. He said the company needed someone who could make commercial decisions without emotional interference. He said these things in the third person, about a category of person, while looking at his folder. He glanced at me once during the whole speech. Once. The bylaw amendment that dissolved my seat on the operational committee passed 9-3. I was one of the 3. I was the only one in that room whose grandfather's name was on the sign above the loading dock. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I sat with my folder in my lap until the meeting was adjourned, thanked the 2 people who caught my eye on the way out, and walked into the January parking lot where my car had collected a film of road salt and frozen slush along the wheel wells. I drove 4 hours south to Toronto. I checked into a hotel near the distillery district that I couldn't really afford, and I sat on the bed in my blazer for a long time, without turning on the television or ordering food or calling anyone, just sitting there with the city sound coming in through the window, trying to feel something clean enough to act on. What I finally landed on wasn't grief and it wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was the understanding that I was going to have to build something, and that it was going to take longer than I wanted, and that I was going to have to build it in a way that couldn't be dismissed. I took a contract role with a supply chain consulting firm in Mississauga that winter, then moved into a permanent position with a manufacturing operations company in Hamilton the following year. I enrolled in the graduate certificate program in operations management through McMaster, taking evening and weekend courses, writing papers at kitchen tables in apartments. I never fully unpacked because the work was always more important than making the place feel like home. I earned credentials. I built a client list. I learned how to read a corporate balance sheet the way my grandfather had taught me to read a board of lumber. Looking for the stress fractures, the hidden moisture content, the things that looked fine from the face but were rotting from the inside. I told myself, most days, that I was building a career. That was true, but there was something else underneath it. Something I mostly kept quiet even from myself. I was building a case. Not for a courtroom. For a moment, I couldn't fully see yet, but could feel the outline of the way you can sometimes feel a storm system a day before it arrives. My cousin, my uncle's youngest daughter, Dinah, stayed on at the company through all of it. She'd been in the finance department since she was 23 and knew the accounts the way I knew the product lines, which is to say she knew where the bodies were buried before anyone had started digging. She called me every couple of months, not to report anything, just to maintain the thread. She'd voted with the majority at the board meeting, and I think she'd been sorry about it from almost the moment the vote was counted, but we had made a silent agreement that we were never going to talk about it directly. Some things stay functional, precisely, because you don't pull them into the light. The first time she said something that made me actually take notes was about 16 months after I left. She mentioned, offhand, like she was passing along weather, that the company had taken out a second charge against the Perry Sound facility. The original mill site, the one my grandfather had built first, the one with the oldest equipment and the highest symbolic weight in the whole operation. She said it like it was just a routine refinancing decision. I said nothing. I filed it somewhere it wouldn't get lost. A few months after that, she mentioned that the company had parted ways with two of the senior sawyers, both men who'd worked the mill for over 12 years, and replaced them with hires my uncle had brought in through someone he knew from a business association in Barrie. No hardwood processing experience. One of them had come from a metals fabrication plant, the other from a big box home improvement warehouse. She mentioned this the way you mention a personnel change, neutrally, but her voice had something underneath it that sounded like the beginning of alarm. Then the shipment started slipping. I heard about it from an old contact at a flooring distributor in Kitchener. Not from Dinah, someone who'd been sending Blaine and Chart orders for 17 years out of loyalty and habit, and who called me one afternoon to say diplomatically that he was starting to wonder whether the habit was still earning its keep. I told Dinah when she called next that I didn't want her to send me anything. I was clear about why. I was not going to be accused of corporate espionage or breach of fiduciary duty. I was not going to give anyone a reason to make this about me rather than about the numbers. What I would do, what I did, was spend my evenings working through everything that was publicly and legally available. PPSA registrations, Ontario Business Registry filings, civil litigation notices on CanLI. 3 separate court records for contractor payment disputes that had been filed in Simcoe County over the preceding 18 months. It is slow, unglamorous work, reading public databases for patterns, but I had been doing slow, unglamorous work for 2 years and I had developed a tolerance for it. The pattern, when it emerged, was legible. 3 transport contracts covering nearly half of the company's outbound shipping. Contracts that had previously been distributed across 4 different regional carriers on a competitive basis had been consolidated with a single logistics company called Northgate Haulage Solutions, incorporated in Ontario roughly 14 months before the first contract was signed. One of Northgate's registered directors was a man named Terry Foss. Terry Foss was my uncle's brother-in-law. Terry Foss had no background in freight or logistics. His previous business, a landscaping operation out of Aurelia, had been voluntarily dissolved in 2019. I hired a forensic accountant, a former colleague named Vera Lau, who'd left our Hamilton firm a year before I had, and now ran her own practice out of Waterloo. I was explicit with her, everything sourced from public records only. Nothing that could be characterized as improperly obtained. She worked through it for 5 months, cross-referencing regional freight rate indices, reading PPSA schedules, mapping the corporate structure of Northgate against publicly available directorship records. When she was finished, her report documented approximately $2.3 million Canadian in liabilities connected to transport contracts, priced at rates between 20 and 40% above market average. With no record of competitive tendering, and a financial beneficiary structure that led directly back to my uncle's family. It wasn't theft in any way a Crown prosecutor would touch. My uncle would have had a lawyer ready to explain why it wasn't, and the lawyer would probably have been right in the technical sense. But mismanagement with a clear financial beneficiary is a thing that lenders care about when your line of credit comes up for review. I had looked at the company's credit timeline. I knew the renewal was scheduled for the following spring. I knew that at their current liability ratio, the bank would require comprehensive disclosure. I knew my uncle did not have clean disclosure to give. So I kept Vera's report in a folder at the back of my desk drawer and I waited. Patience, at 29, had felt like a performance, something I did to seem reasonable. By 33, it had become structural. It was the way I operated. The discipline of not acting before the moment is right is not a passive thing. It takes more out of you than acting does. But it's the only weapon that can't be turned around and used against you. It was Dinah who finally broke, not out of strategy or timing. She called me on a Wednesday evening in March because she had seen the bank's preliminary review letter that afternoon and she understood what it meant and she was frightened. Not for herself alone, though she was frightened for herself, but for the 11 other people in the office and for the 40-some workers on the mill floor who had stayed through 2 years of uncertain management and declining order volume, because the mill was the biggest employer in the area and because some of their fathers had worked there before them, and they didn't know what a life outside of it looked like. She said she didn't know what to do. I said I did. I did not go to my uncle. I drove north instead. Not to Perry Sound, not yet. To a property on a lake outside of Huntsville, belonging to a man named Lawrence Chadwick. Lawrence had been my grandfather's original business partner. He was 81 years old, still served as an advisory member of the founding board in a capacity my uncle had let go ceremonial, and had voted against removing me from the operational committee 4 years earlier. He hadn't made a scene about it. He had simply voted no, quietly, and then said nothing more about it. I had not forgotten. He met me at the door in an old Carhartt vest and showed me inside without a lot of ceremony. I put Vera's report on his kitchen table. He sat down and read it in full. He read it a second time. He had poured himself a cup of tea before I arrived, and it went cold while he was reading. When he finished, he looked up at me and asked how long I had been sitting on it. I said long enough to be sure. He picked up his phone and called 2 outside board members that evening. An emergency session was arranged for the following week. I was not invited to attend. I didn't need to be. Lawrence Chadwick had been building and governing companies since before my uncle had taken his first sales job, and there is a kind of authority that has nothing to do with who holds the most shares. It comes from having been right consistently for 50 years, and it is very difficult to argue with in a boardroom. By the close of that meeting, my uncle had been asked to step aside as CEO pending an independent audit. The resolution was not close. He came to my apartment in Hamilton 4 days later. I hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years. He looked older than I'd expected, smaller, in some way that had nothing to do with his physical size. His voice was the same. That old certainty was still there, even when the ground under it had entirely given way. He said I had always wanted this, that I had been biding my time since the day of that board meeting, waiting for a chance to humiliate him. He said I had never cared about the company, only about winning. He said these things standing in my doorway like a man who still believed his presence in a room constituted an argument. I let him finish before I said anything. Then I said, I didn't incorporate Northgate. I didn't sign the transport contracts. I didn't put Terry on the directorship. I didn't restructure the line of credit against a property my grandfather built. I found out what was happening, I documented it through public filings, and I brought it to a board member with the standing to act on it. That's not a score. That's just what accountability looks like when someone does it without making themselves the center of it. He shifted tactics after that, the way people like him always do when direct challenge doesn't work. He mentioned a fishing trip up to Temagami when I was 11. He mentioned teaching me to handle the forklift when I was 16, out in the South Yard, how he had laughed when I stalled it twice before I got the hang of the counterweight. He said the word family several times. Each time he said it, it sounded more like a legal argument, and less like something real. Family, I said, does not call a board meeting and strip someone's operational role because she makes the wrong people uncomfortable at the table. You taught me that. I was just slower to understand what you meant than you expected me to be. He left without answering. It was the last real conversation we ever had. The audit ran 4 months. Northgate's contracts were terminated within the first 6 weeks, once the auditors confirmed the pricing irregularities Vera had already mapped. Terry Foss resigned from every Blaine and Chard-connected position before the public summary of findings was released. The injunction my uncle's lawyer had threatened to file against the audit process was withdrawn before it was ever served. Lawrence told me afterward that the lawyer had advised him that pursuing it would expose the Northgate arrangement to significantly more legal scrutiny than stepping back would. My uncle kept his shares. That was his right under the shareholder agreement, and I wasn't going to spend energy on what the law had already settled. He withdrew from operations entirely. His name stayed on the letterhead for a few months after that, and then it was quietly removed. I don't know exactly when it happened. I didn't mark it. Dinah was promoted to controller 6 weeks after the audit closed. She called me when she found out, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Something unclenched. We still didn't talk about the board vote. I think we have both decided we never will. The thing about guilt is that the person who carries it usually knows what they owe better than anyone else does, and Dinah had paid her debt in the years between. In the quiet way she had kept me informed without ever being asked, and without ever breaching anything she shouldn't breach. That was enough for me. The mill workers who had been quietly calling competitors in Midland and Owen Sound started staying. The flooring distributor in Kitchener rang me directly. Not the company number, my number, and asked if it was safe to renew his standing order. I told him the management was changing, and that I thought he'd be happy with what he saw by the following quarter. He said that was good enough for him. It was the most satisfying professional phone call I'd had in 4 years. The remaining board offered me the Chief Operating Officer role 2 months after the audit report was published. I said yes on one condition, that a succession framework be formally ratified by the full board with a recorded vote, replacing the informal understanding my father had sketched out over years of conversation and never put into binding form. Lawrence arranged to sit in for that vote in person, even though he'd been preparing his withdrawal from the advisory board for months. He said he wanted to be in the room when it was done. I understood why. He stepped back from the board the following month. I drove out to his property on the lake to thank him properly. He made tea. We sat on his dock in the late April cold, and he told me that my grandfather would have played it exactly the same way. Not because my grandfather was sentimental, but because my grandfather had understood something that most people never fully learn, that the loudest move is rarely the most powerful one, and that the person willing to wait for the right moment almost always has more leverage than the person who acts on the first one. I sat with that for a long time afterward. I'm still sitting with it. A year later, on an early Thursday in May, I drove north to Parry Sound when the bay was still cold enough to see your breath across it, and the spruce along the ridgeline was just starting to put out new growth. I parked in the same spot in the mill yard where I had stood the morning I left. The air off the water was the same. The smell of cut wood and machine oil and lake cold was the same. The south building was exactly as I remembered, including the grading table in the corner and the stack of white ash samples in the archive room that had not been touched or moved or even dusted in 4 years. I ran my fingers along the edge of one sample, a clear-grained piece I had personally selected from the drying kiln the summer before my father died. The grain was tight and even. Good ash holds its character regardless of what happens around it. That is the thing about quality material. It doesn't change because someone decides it isn't worth their attention for a season. It waits. My uncle once told a room full of people that I was too sentimental about legacy to be trusted with the future. He was wrong about the sentimentality. What he had mistaken for sentiment was something more precise than that. It was the ability to read what a thing is actually worth, independent of what someone confident and well-dressed decides to tell you it's worth at a given board meeting in a given year. I did not inherit Blaine and Chard Millworks. What I have instead took 4 years of evening courses and weekend reports and careful, sourced, documented, patient work to build, and it is something that cannot be voted away in a bylaw amendment or dissolved in a room I wasn't invited to attend. It is the kind of thing, as my grandfather used to say when he held a board up to the light and found no hidden flaws, that holds.